Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Bottom Line podcast from Liverpool Echo's Blood Red channel, covering everything off the pitch at Liverpool Football Club. Today, you've got a special guest with me. It's Daniel Haddad. He's head of commercial strategy at Octagon. He specialises in the commercial strategy of the global football industry. And today, we're going to talk about Liverpool's own strategy and what the exit from or the absence of Champions League football means for the Reds this season, and also where we could be heading in terms of commercial activity in football and how important it has come to football clubs such as Liverpool. So, Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, it's football has become ever more reliant on money, hence the reason why I'm probably in this role in the first place. But commercial activities underpinned success of football clubs more and more in recent years. I mean, we only have to look at the rise of Manchester City, how they've managed to leverage those commercial relationships they have in the Middle East, etc. How important is it to the major clubs now, their commercial strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's the most important thing apart from, the results on the pitch, and the two are interlinked. And I guess if you just look at the kind of broader market conditions within the global football industry at the moment, the pressure on the big European clubs is going to become ever more intense. So, the news yesterday that the public investment fund in Saudi Arabia are going to be acquiring 4 of the clubs there, the kind of whole strategic push around developing the football infrastructure there. We're already seeing how that is kind of impacting the market on player wages, for instance, with links of now the likes of Benzema heading off there, maybe Ramos, maybe Messi. So, you have to look at the elite European clubs within the global football economy and not just within the European kind of infrastructure. So a lot of changes, FIFA becoming more involved in the club game with the expansion of the Club World Cup coming in 2025. Again, that will start kind of handing maybe a bit more power to some of those clubs outside of Europe who will start to be competing in bigger competitions. So, the pressure on revenues really as a means of allowing a club's cost base to increase is more and more pressing.
It's interesting you mentioned the PIF move yesterday, because obviously they've actually nationalised around 4 clubs there, haven't they? I mean, it's Al Ittihad, Al Hilal, Al Nassr. I can't think of the other one. But I mean, that interesting to me in that respect there. That seems like it could be impactful further down the line in terms of having a knock-on effect for both the transfer market, maybe commercially, what some businesses might try, where they might try and push their money, given the fact that some of the biggest players are going to be headed there.
It adds a new dynamic to players who maybe are, even in their late 20s and maybe have 2-3 years left on their contracts. I mean, if you can start to kind of see those salaries come in your early 30s, I think the kind of difference may be that, we've kind of seen those clubs previously being, a player's destination when they're 35, 36, right at the end of the career. Maybe we're seeing a first instance of if there is, the kind of scale of investment that PIF and the state of Saudi Arabia has at its disposal means that they could kind of fund a project for a lot longer term than maybe China in the past or the MLS. So, we're seeing a dynamic maybe where you're going to be looking at players who, are going to consider spending more of their peak years within the Middle East, which then has a knock-on effect onto the sponsorship market, onto media rights market, and everything like that.
We kind of saw it a little bit, didn't we, with the kind of Chinese Premier League or Super League. So much money went there, and it got to the stage where players like Oscar, who in their prime, were choosing that particular direction. So it'd be interesting to see how that kind of pans out in the coming seasons, given the fact that the transfer market is already and wages are already distorted heavily from spending in Europe. It's adding that different dynamic is going to be intriguing. From a Liverpool perspective, I spoke a few weeks ago to Ben Latty, who's Liverpool's commercial director. Obviously, commercially, Liverpool have been really, really successful in recent years. They've been able to leverage their success on the pitch to great effect. They're already a global brand. through historic performance, and they have that huge legion of fans globally. But their own commercial approach seems a little bit different. I mean, they do a lot of retention of their own of sponsorships. I mean, Standard Chartered by the end of this current deal will probably be around the 17, 18 years mark, I think. And they've got a lot of historic relationships there with Carlsberg, still a corporate sponsor. Then obviously you throw into the mix the Nike deal, which looks set to be a very long-term one, given how so many different things are aligned across the business, whether it be investment from FSG into LeBron James's production company, LeBron James's positioning as an FSG investor and a Nike athlete, etc. How do you view Liverpool's commercial setup? Because it seems to be one of the most kind of well-oiled machines, I suppose, in European football.
Yeah, I think, what all the top kind of elite clubs have done kind of similarly is how they staff the commercial department. So, Manchester United were definitely the leaders in that department maybe a decade ago, and probably, the best thing the Glazers brought to United was a very sophisticated commercial department where, the resource was there to really fully leverage the international brand power of the club. So I think for a number of years, the likes of Liverpool, City, Barcelona, Real Madrid, all those clubs were kind of catching up with the fact that United made that first real investment into specialist sponsorship sales departments, regionalizing the workforce, etc. So, it took a while for the rest of the clubs to catch up just in terms of manpower and resource, which obviously is the first fundamental. If you're going to kind of capitalize on your commercial potential, you need to staff in the right way. Just like if you want to win the Premier League, you need to have the best players on the pitch. To maximize your commercial power, you need to get, the kind of backroom off-pitch staff right. So I think Liverpool have definitely got to the position where they are on par, at least with all other clubs in terms of resource for, fully exploring the marketplace for opportunities. I think from experience of working with Liverpool, the Fenway network in the US is very important. So the US is becoming a much more important market for European football clubs. I think if you look in past years, there was definitely a reliance on Asia, Southeast Asia, really as kind of the number one market outside of Europe in terms of, finding new partners and finding new commercial opportunities. But the US really now is arguably the most important market internationally in terms of brand sponsorships. And there's a number of reasons for that, the growth of soccer in general in the US, but also the Premier League in particular out there. And I think more US based corporations have a deep understanding of what European football is and what it means and the power of that internationally. I guess if you're talking to US brands, you're never going to compete with the major domestic properties for those brands when they're looking to target US consumers. But as they've kind of globalized internationally, I think there's a much greater understanding of the power of the Premier League. So the Fenway, infrastructure in the US and how that intersects with the Liverpool FC commercial team is very sophisticated. And that definitely has led to a lot more opportunities being created. So in terms of the role of Fenway and the FSG's model in terms of maximizing Liverpool's potential in the US, that's definitely been a success. And I think, Dave, you kind of referenced the point around retention of sponsors. So, I think a lot of people outside the industry may always be looking at, the size of the newest deal and getting new partners on board. But we're seeing with a couple of clubs, so Chelsea would be one example, that if your kind of big long-term premium sponsors decide they don't want to renew their deals, then going back out to market and finding a replacement can be very difficult because it is a highly competitive market. And, if you're a club selling your major assets, shirt, sponsorship, sleeve, training kit, etc., at any one time, there's going to be some of your competitors selling similar assets. You've got F1 that's becoming kind of more global and doing really well at the moment. and then obviously, you know, UEFA and the Champions League, etc. So it's the competitive set of clubs is so large now that, you know, going to market for big assets can bring big rewards. So, you know, Liverpool changing from New Balance to Nike is a clear example of that. But, you know, on some of those bigger partnerships, what you want to be able to do is grow them kind of organically over time through extension and expansion rather than finding new partners. And I guess what Liverpool have done very well is servicing partners once they're on board. And, you know, it does speak to the power of the global Liverpool fan base that once a brand has decided to invest in Liverpool over United or Madrid or Barcelona or whoever else they might be kind of considering, there is, after they've spent a few years as a partner of the club and activating the partnerships, it does seem that they really then truly buy into, you know, what Liverpool would say about themselves in terms of the scale and passion of the fan base. So that really is the cornerstone of any successful sponsorship model, that you're long-term, you know, there's always going to be partners and brands that come and go, just global economic conditions, you know, things that happen within individual businesses that are unpredictable. But if you can retain, you know, 60-70% of your sponsors when the contract's coming up for renewal, then, you know, you're looking at consistent organic growth over time.
The Nike deal is something which I've written a lot about, and we've had guests on to talk about, etc. There is a view that's kind of there is no real ceiling on that, I suppose. I think it was Liverpool's view of getting the best deal they could. Obviously, they take a lower annual rate from Nike, and the upside is the 20% they get back from the sale of branded merchandise, etc. But the things they have aligned in terms to grow that are far more kind of nuanced, I suppose. You've got LeBron James, who is, while, you know, people know him over here as a basketball player, and he was in Space Jam 2, etc. In the US, he is something of a cultural phenomenon. People either love him or hate him, type of thing. He has that sports effect, I think. Because he's played for some kind of divisive teams in divisive markets, etc. But he is someone that has the real. He is kind of a cultural phenomenon, almost to the scale of, well, not quite to the scale of Michael Jordan, because I think that was something which I also imagine we'll see the likes of again, given the fact that how Nike have built an entire brand on Michael Jordan, almost a shoe brand. But there is Liverpool seems to be making a push now towards kind of a lifestyle brand, etc., to open their commercial avenues up to people that may not be the traditional fan. They may not have, you know, they may not be so emotionally invested in the football club, and they may have an affinity with it, but they like the merchandise. So Nike obviously own Converse, and they brought in Converse into that. It seems it's and the US, you mentioned before. I mean, it's such a kind of a fertile marketplace, I suppose, for football clubs at the moment, given the fact we're kind of rolling towards USA 2026. You've got the MLS, which is now starting to take root properly within the kind of the American sports psyche. And then you've got the growing popularity of the Premier League, which I think is the second most watched league in the USA. I think it's Liga MX, which is the most watched, largely because of the demographics around that. But I mean, do you see this kind of Nike play where everything, there are so many simpatico relationships that exist beyond, across a number of companies and entities and individuals? I mean, that seems very much a kind of an FSG play. I mean, did you see this having being a significant deal further down the line for Liverpool?
Yeah, and you kind of went over a few of the key points, Dave. I mean, you know, the size of the global sports merchandising industry is something that I think the US has always understood. And, you know, the fact that, you know, NBA, NFL teams, etc., don't really ever change the playing kit, but still, if you look at revenues from sports merchandise in the US, you know, that just shows that they've always thought about that model a bit differently to how maybe European clubs have thought about it, in terms of you've got your home away, third, fourth, fifth, whatever kit, and then, maybe a more limited product line after that. So, just look at the size of Fanatics, the business, like the kind of, number one global merchandise business. And, they grew their business by creating kind of those on-field product lines for all the major sports leagues in the US. So, there's definitely a big opportunity to grow, merchandising revenue through diversification of a product line. Because also, that kind of also takes into account that fans in different markets may want different things. A Chinese Liverpool fan may want a completely different product to one in India to one in the UK, just because of culturally the type of clothing that people wear in those markets. So, that for those reasons, being associated with Nike or an Adidas really becomes more important, because they have the distribution scale and also, the resource to kind of create more and more product lines, and also have more natural ways to extend, those product lines. So Adidas with Originals, for instance, Nike, as you mentioned, through, what they've done with Jordan, with PSG, or with kind of LeBron and LFC. So, it's definitely an area that many clubs are pushing, because, as I say, you're also then getting repeat business from fans. So you don't have many fans every year who buy multiple kits. Usually fans tend to buy one or the other. But you might have fans who buy a kit and then 2 or 3 different other product lines. And that's why actually you've seen the extension of things like the training wear range, and you see the club launch these things at different times. So they always now make quite a big thing about launching, the kind of training collection and etc. So, it's probably more marginal gains compared to kind of some other commercial areas like media rights and total sponsorship revenue. But, there's a high growth ceiling, looking at actually the nature of football fandom and the scale of that.
Moving on to kind of on-field matters, obviously it was a season of disappointment in the end for Liverpool. I mean, they missed out on the Champions League in the end. It was long expected that they would. They made a fist of it down the final stretch, but ultimately came up short. So it's Europa League football for them next season. My understanding is it won't be impactful to commercial deals that are already locked in. I know a couple of years ago, there was some that kind of surfaced with regards to Manchester United, because I think they were 2 years into the Europa League, and there was a concern that if it ran over into a third year, then the value of some deals starts to get knocked down, etc. But in terms of Liverpool, really, like United in that respect, I suppose, while it's not a concern right now or for the short to medium term, they kind of have to be part of that Champions League elite regularly in order to kind of leverage, give themselves some leverage and a strong negotiating position when it comes to kind of these commercial deals, because ultimately they've got the challenge, certainly for Liverpool, given how they operate under FSG. It's a self-sustaining model whereby there has to be organic growth within the business to prop up player acquisition and increase payroll, etc. So I suppose while they'll be very much hoping this season is just a blip, but I imagine they'll have one eye on how they really need to address these type of things in order that they remain part of the Champions League elite moving forward, and they get access to those commercial revenues.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you referenced that. I think short term, the impact is minimal. Even from a revenue perspective, I think, there's a big difference between qualifying for the Champions League and having a good run, right? So I think the season, where, last season, or if we say 2 seasons ago, I don't know, but the final against Madrid, I think Liverpool earned probably about £65 million or so from that run of getting to the final. Whereas this season, being knocked out in before the quarterfinals, that I believe will be about £25 million. So there's obviously a big difference. So people talk about qualifying for the Champions League, but actually what they should be talking about is, getting to the latter stages. And, if Liverpool do progress all the way to the final in the Europa League that a lot of people are kind of assuming could be the case, then actually the delta between what they'd get in that scenario versus what they've earned this season of Champions League participation probably won't be too far apart. So, from a short-term perspective, I think there's actually a chance that the revenue gap between, how this season went on the pitch and next season could be more or less the same. And then I think, you've got to have an eye towards the changes in the Champions League from 2024-25, where there'll be more money to the participating clubs because the competition's expanding. So we're going to the Swiss format, one large group, an extra couple of games at least for each club, from competing in that one group format, but also more qualification routes. So, the Premier League is probably going to be the beneficiary of the kind of best loser nation, right? So there's a possibility that, let's say next season, Liverpool don't win the Europa League and finish outside the top four, they could still qualify for the following season's Champions League based on, an algorithm somewhere. But that's also important because if you look at the Premier League now, you can make a case for there being 7 teams every year that would be fighting for 4, maybe 5 spaces. So I think the kind of, it's a double-edged sword, right? Fans don't want a Super League. They don't want guaranteed qualification spots. But at the same time, I think every club, maybe with the exception of Man City now, will probably have to get used to the fact that there may be a season every now and again where there just aren't enough places to go around. So and for Liverpool, that's not been, necessarily something uncommon in pre-Klopp days. There were seasons where, the club were outside the Champions League. So I think, the whole dynamic of Champions League football, I think a lot of fans probably don't quite realise, but that will be changing in a year's time. But on the point of commercial kind of partners, sponsors, you also mentioned, Dave, that, most sponsors, have minimal impact of that from like their tangible assets. Obviously, the likes of Standard Chartered, etc., will get less visibility just from the lack of, Champions League football and lower TV audiences in Europa League. But, the power of Liverpool as a marketing platform remains the same. And, we saw with Man United and like a fairly lean run post Ferguson for a while that never really had any impact on commercial deals because the foundations were so strong. So I think Liverpool would argue that they also kind of created those foundations that a year, 2 years, however, of like lower success than there's been over the past 4 or 5 won't really cause a ripple. And I tend to agree with that. But obviously longer term, when you are pitching against Man City, United, Madrid, Barcelona, you don't want to be lower on some metrics if they're within your control. So, being out of the Champions League, on a PowerPoint slide versus one from Man United will stick out at times. So that's why it is important that it does remain as that consistent piece. But also, as I mentioned before, you've got the FIFA Club World Cup coming up. Liverpool don't want to not be, it's likely they would qualify given the amount of European teams that are in. I think at the moment, Chelsea and Real Madrid are the only 2 that are locked in, and then either the winner of City and Inter in this year's final. But you wouldn't want a scenario where Liverpool aren't represented in 25 in the Club World Cup, for instance. So, there are the club football ecosystem is changing, and even though the Super League move was defeated, competition structures are changing quite significantly over the next couple of years. So, that creates more commercial opportunity, but it creates more risk of, if you're kind of out on the outside.
You mentioned there about Liverpool trying to keep their metrics in line with some of the biggest and the best in Europe. The brand finance report dropped today, in fact, and it kind of charts the brand strength and the brand value of the biggest 50 football clubs in world football. Liverpool dropped to fifth, I think, in terms of their brand value. I think he came into about just shy of 1.2 billion. Important to stress that's not the valuation placed upon the football club; it's the value of the brand. For those that are listening, interestingly, the brand strength of the football club remains strong. So I think last year they were second. This year they remain second, only behind Real Madrid. I think a brand strength of something like just shy of 94 out of 100. So it shows the appeal that Liverpool continue to have, despite the fact that Manchester City are obviously they are the dominant force in European football, not just English football at the moment. And you have so many other football clubs of huge historical significance all fight it out in there. It remains Liverpool just behind Real Madrid in terms of that brand strength. I mean, why does that endure so much Liverpool's appeal in terms of its brand strength really across Europe? Because obviously they've had great success over the past 6-7 years under Jurgen Klopp. I mean, he's an engaging manager. They played a kind of engaging brand of football, but it's as did many other teams, and some have achieved more success. So, why do you feel that Liverpool's brand strength has endured?
Yeah, there's a couple of dynamics. I mean, number one amongst those is, we're seeing a period where the Premier League is pulling away from the other European leagues. The ripple effects of that are clear, and it goes back to the whole Super League conversation and the clubs that are still, ploughing that furrow versus the Premier League clubs. So every big Premier League club has a competitive advantage against, even the likes of Real Madrid, Barcelona, etc. So, it's the strength, and I think, hopefully the kind of big clubs will remember that it's the strength of the collective that is the thing pushing the Premier League and why it is where it is. So that's not just down to Liverpool, United, City. That is down to, the whole kind of collective agreement and the strength of the group and the culture of British football. So number one, being in the Premier League gives you that foundation that protects your brand because it's the most globally watched league in the world. It's going to continue to be. There is no foreseeable scenario really where La Liga or Serie A or the Bundesliga starts to kind of erode into the Premier League's, share of voice internationally. So that's number one. And then number two, I guess, that there are so many different ways of like creating rankings around football clubs, right? So you've got this brand finance report, you've got the Deloitte Money League, you've got the Forbes, franchise valuations. I mean, they all, the one kind of consistent metric they all flow back to is, audience and globality and fan base. And, if you ignore the numbers that are pushed out around how many fans different clubs have, because, the methodologies are pretty flimsy sometimes. But if you look kind of on a comparative level, Liverpool and United still are quite significantly ahead of every other Premier League club and, are in the company of Real Madrid and Barcelona. So you do have 4 super brands in terms of, relative share of voice globally. And then what you've seen the clubs that aren't within that kind of 4 do is different things to differentiate themselves, elevate their brands, etc. So in the case of Man City, City Football Group has been a success in terms of this network of global clubs. The investment into the Etihad, the development of, the new music venue on the campus, the extension of that. These are all things that, are, help a club where the historic global audience is not at the level of those. So, Liverpool, I guess, are in a unique position where that kind of global fan base, was always there. It never really eroded through difficult years, and actually has definitely seen a new boost because, football in some markets is still growing in popularity. So China, India, the US, as you mentioned. So actually, it's probably a good time to be successful. So a lot of people talk about United in the 90s where the Premier League was globalizing, having success then and capitalizing on it. That's definitely true. But I'd also say now that the Premier League's growth trajectory means it's also now a good time to have success because there are a lot of lot of kind of new fans still out there to capture. So Liverpool's success since Klopp, has definitely had an impact to, keep that growth in line with kind of Madrid, Barcelona, United, but also accelerate it as well. So, probably have been proportionally growing faster than those other clubs within that same period.
Just to finish, where do you think we're heading with this? Because I've spoken to numerous people around this, whether it's on podcasts or for interviews or just in general conversation, in terms of how we commercialise football. We've seen, certainly since once one traditional industry in terms of gambling seemed to have to be forced to move away from football, and it moved due to government legislation which is set to come in. There was a brief move towards crypto, which opened up as a new market. Obviously, that's been beset by some problems across Europe in terms of, we've seen kind of Whalefin have to row back on a deal with Chelsea and Atletico Madrid. Then we have Digital Bits at Inter Milan. They had to end. So that was a kind of a period of entering into these commercial agreements with some of the unknown in a new marketplace. But there's going to be more of that. There's going to be new markets that open up new opportunities to commercialise. But how are the biggest clubs, do you think, going to go around driving forward their commercial revenue? It's not simply a case now of selling advertising hoardings, etc. It's far more nuanced than that. I know there's technology that they're thinking about adopting in terms of where you can place particular ads for brands based upon what marketplace is watching. So there's so many different ways we go, and a lot of this is all hinged upon the technology to be able to deliver it. But where do you see kind of the next, I'm not going to ask you for a crystal ball thing here for the next 25, 30 years, but for the next 5 or 10 years, do you think we're likely to see a major change?
Yeah, I think, if you look at the trend of investment into football clubs and where that investment is coming from. So hedge funds kind of backed investment or nation state investments, etc. It hints that, there is a large degree of confidence outside of the UK and at a global level that the football industry has a long way still to grow in terms of total economic size, because otherwise you would not be seeing, the type of bidding that is coming in for, clubs like Chelsea, United, when Liverpool was mooted to kind of, maybe be open for a takeover, etc. So the market confidence is there. And I guess the other thing I'd always look back to is if you look through kind of the whole concept behind the Super League, and it was kind of hinting at two things. Number one is there is definitely at some point, and it's been talked about to death, but there is definitely at some point a breakaway from the traditional broadcasting model that still kind of restricts football's ability to monetize a bit more, like how a Amazon or a Facebook or a TikTok, etc. would monetize. Because if we talk about sponsorship, it's, it still has a massive role to play, but it's quite a traditional transactional kind of business model. Whereas, a more ad-led solution around content, is funding media and content across verticals outside of football. So I still think there's a point at where the broadcast scenario and landscape changes, which means that the ability to monetize football content changes as well. And why I mentioned the Super League is that if you look through the articles of association and the memorandums that were released around that, one of the key elements was that the kind of founding member clubs wanted to retain a lot of the broadcast rights to either kind of stream the games themselves or kind of experiment with new technologies, etc. So, one of the things that I guess was driving a lot of Super League conversations was, if we do this ourselves, we don't have to sell the rights to BT and Sky, whatever. We can put it on our platforms and monetize. So I think that is coming at some point, and whether that is done through, a collective like the Premier League, or whether that is done through individual clubs or a collective of clubs, that is something that will be coming. And when it does, if the technology is right and it's made accessible enough, there's a huge revenue opportunity through selling more digital and programmatic led advertising through the global stream. So, if you think that you have, let's say 20 million people globally watch Liverpool Man United, I mean, you can think around a lot of ways to monetize that through, audiences kind of subscribing and buying passes to watch, but also the advertising around that. So I think that is one area where there is a big upside somewhere in the future. And, the whole kind of football industry and sports industry in general is trying to navigate a scenario where the guaranteed paychecks right now are so big that they're hard to leave behind, and there would be a period of transition. But that kind of business opportunity is there, and at some point it's unforeseeable that won't change. So that for me would be kind of number one area of commercial growth. The second one would be competition formats. So again, Super League, one of the reasons why it was mooted is because, by changing competition structures, the clubs obviously see a way of creating more value. That's why I think the FIFA Club World Cup is, the extension of that, is a pretty good idea, because again, it's they're putting it in a slot in the calendar that's outside of the regular season. It's not going to be every year, and actually you're going to get a lot of kind of global interest if you're going to have MLS teams competing. You might have teams from Saudi Arabia in that, China, etc. But there are definitely going to be new competition formats that are going to be proposed, mooted. Champions League format, as I've just mentioned, is changing for at least one cycle. Who knows where that'll end up in the future? So I think we need to look at, indicators and long term, what's happening within football, and kind of see what that's saying in terms of revenue opportunities, rather than, short term things like individual sectors investing in sponsorship, because, that will always change, but there's a very clear ceiling on revenue potential through sponsorship, whereas through, advertising, media rights, these elements, there's still a huge growth potential out there.
And it's those media rights which are really core, and they're what attract a lot of the US hedge funds and private equity to kind of come into European football in the first place. Be interesting to see what happens. We may yet get a Prem Flicks further on down the line. Who knows? But Dan, really huge thanks for coming on and for sharing your insight with us. It's been really, really fascinating. And we'll hopefully talk again soon. Maybe hopefully next time be around a Liverpool qualification for the Champions League and the lucrative possibilities that come along with that. But that's for another time. But Dan, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Enjoyed that. Cheers.